And welcome back to WGN-TV Political Report. The last 2 years have brought America into a new age of political and civil unrest through a pandemic and racial reckoning across the country. Now, my next guest wanted to get to the source of it all, studying 3 places he knew firsthand, including Chicago. Evan Osnos is a staff writer at The New Yorker who previously worked for the Chicago Tribune's Beijing bureau. His experiences at home and abroad led him to author the new book, Wildland: The Making of America's Fury. Evan, good to see you. Congratulations on the book. You talk about different places you've lived. It creates a coherent story, but we have to focus in on Chicago, which is central to the book. And I want to start with Barack Obama, because, of course, the ground for his library now broken. And so a lot of attention on him again. But I want to take it back to an interview you did with him back during the one election in his life he lost against Bobby Rush. Tell me about the Obama. I know this wasn't exactly Frost Nixon back then, but tell me about the Obama you met then and what propelled him to become the Barack Obama we know now.
Yeah, and you know, Paul, it was not my greatest journalistic achievement. I think my experience with then law professor, State Senator Barack Obama in 1999. I'm embarrassed to admit I ended up taping over my interview with him then. But what was really noticeable and stayed with me, and of course it made a big impression on me at the time, was that he was talking about politics in grand terms, the kind of terms which he then did 5 years later at that fateful moment in front of the Democratic National Convention, when he talked about the idea of reaching across between blue and red. And it can feel, I think, to us now, Paul, almost a little bit like an antique from another era, a moment of hope in that way. But he was tapping into something that is durable, which is the longing for that kind of connection, which feels more acute to us when we don't have it. But I think that the Barack Obama I met then was not yet a particularly good and concise speaker. He was still learning his instrument, and yet he also was beginning to conceive of talking about politics in really inspiring terms. And I saw the effect he had on people around him. At the time, he used to greet everybody without a hat and gloves in the middle of the winter, and some of his aides called him the Kenyan Kennedy. But I think there was a degree to which he clearly had this political gift, and I felt lucky to see it at that early stage.
And if only we had that tape. I hope something good was over it. Look, you focus a lot on Chicago, and you write about Chicago's, your words, epic inequality. You point to segregation as the cause. And interestingly enough, you said, you want to understand power in Chicago? I thought you were going to look at the dailies. You said, no, look at the gangster disciples. Talk about that.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting. And, you know, I decided to look at the gangster disciples because there is, as we all know, a wonderful literature on the conventional metrics of power. How does City Hall work? How does it relate to Springfield? How does it relate to Washington? Then I came upon a quirky fact, which is that the Gangster Disciples, of course, at one point the largest gang in the city of Chicago, was founded by a guy named Larry Hoover, went to prison, and in prison he read Mike Royko's epic account of the old man, of Richard J. Daley, boss. And that gave Hoover a conception of how he might be able to get the Gangster Disciples to find its way to the edges of politics. It's lost to history now. There was a time when that gang was, in fact, getting involved in politics. They formed a political action committee. The reason why I draw attention to this is that so many of the things that I write about in this, Paul, are about who has power, who wants it, and what are they willing to do to get it or to hold on to it. And I think when you go back through history, not just the last 20 years, which is really my focus in the book, but when you go back 120 years or so in Chicago history, those battles over physical land, territory, who controls it, who has access to resources, that's the central abiding question about how Chicago politics functions, as it does in any city. In some ways, I think the reason why I gravitated to Chicago politics is not only because of my personal connections there, but also because it has been really for over 100 years, as Frederick Jackson Turner put it once, the place where all the forces in the nation intersect. And segregation is an important factor in Chicago and an important factor around the country.
And your book is told through the story of so many, including what you just mentioned, really your great-grandfather, who at UFC was shot and lived to talk about it. People have to read the book to understand that powerful story. Let me continue with the violence concept, since I'm really leading into that. A lot of people think the problem in Chicago, it's coming over the line from Indiana, and you tell us, no, not true.
Now, that's one of the surprises for me in this research was, of course, we talk about the role that guns from Indiana and Wisconsin play. But when you get and start talking to some of the federal agents who are tracking this, what they call the iron pipeline, which is the way that guns move around the country, they take you to places. Another place that matters to me, which is West Virginia. My first job out of school was at a little newspaper there. And they will tell you that in the year 2016, more guns were trafficked from West Virginia to places like Chicago, Philadelphia, Albany than anywhere else in the country. I mention this because I think those kinds of connections that are sort of hidden just below the surface help us understand not only the city, but also the country today.
You write about Rahm a lot, so we've got to talk about that, Rahm Emanuel. And you have breakfast with him, I think it was, in a popular West Loop place that he liked to go. What was that place? Do you remember? Because you didn't mention
I wish I had it at the tip of my fingers, but I don't.
Okay, we all want to know that, probably Lou Mitchell's. Anyway, so you talk about 2015, the days of Laquan McDonald, and you say Chicago politics were at a moment of change at that point. Rahm seemed to know it, but you called him defiant.
You know, you'll remember this period, Paul. This was the time when he was saying there was nothing that we could have done better. He then, of course, apologized and said actually mistakes were made in how the Laquan tape was handled. There was a sort of famous tearful moment in front of the city council. But something deeper was going on there, I think, which was that he recognized that a certain kind of a generation of political power that he was a part of it, you know, in some sense, it was partly traced to the Dalys. It was also connected to his time in the Obama White House, that there was a moment of transition happening. Eventually, Lori Lightfoot was the beneficiary of that moment of transition, a surprise for many people at the time. But that was Rahm's political antenna, which are so alert. You know, he knows when power is moving. And of course, he then later, after that breakfast, not too long afterwards, announced that he wasn't running for re-election. But I could sense in an interesting way that he was wrestling with his role in that moment in the Laquan McDonald case and wrestling with what his legacy would be as mayor. He wanted to be regarded as somebody who made an effort to try to improve the city, but I think he recognized that the moment had arrived for him to make way for somebody else.
And beyond his decision, of course, you write that Chicago became a symbol for Trump. Quite symbolic with your words, gun violence was exhausting with outsiders who were sensationalizing it, and Trump keeps going with that.
Yeah, he turned it into a kind of political symbol. I mean, it was, I think for anybody who's paying attention to his rhetoric, Chicago became a kind of piece of the rhetorical furniture. He would talk about Democrat-run cities, as he would put it. And what he was really trying to do was create an image of cities as ungovernable, as the idea of something that was something to be afraid of. He talked in somewhat very explicit terms during the campaign of 2020 about how the suburbs will be overrun. Look, I think that bothers a lot of folks who care about the city, care about what's happening. It gets to attention, which is, on the one hand, there is obviously the violence is something that people want to see addressed in Chicago, and it has been going on now and getting worse in ways that nobody pretends is not a problem. And yet at the same time, it can be used as a political opportunistic tool, marshaled in service of advancing somebody's individual political goals. And that's the tension I was trying to capture, both a problem and also something that was turned into a piece of political rhetoric.
You do, and you capture that. You capture it through story. It's really such an easy to read book and fascinating book, not just about Chicago, about a couple of other places you've lived. But thanks for helping me focus in on the place that is in our hearts, and that's our hometown, Chicago. Thank you, Evan.
My pleasure. Thanks, Paul.
One more break, and we'll be back after this.